The message came in the middle of the afternoon, casual enough to look harmless, short enough to pretend it didn't mean much. I was in the middle of reviewing contracts when my phone lit up, and for a moment, I almost ignored it. But something about the timing made me pick it up anyway. It was from my sister. That alone was unusual. We didn't talk much unless it was something important, or something that needed to sound important. I opened the message expecting logistics, maybe a last-minute update, maybe a detail about dinner plans. Instead, I read the same sentence twice before it fully registered. Hey, I think it's just better for the family image if you stay home this year. There was no build-up, no explanation before it, no attempt to soften it beyond a single word that didn't belong there better. For a few seconds, I just stared at the screen, not reacting, not even blinking. It wasn't the first time I had felt that distance from them, but this was different. This was deliberate. This wasn't forgetting to include me. This was choosing not to. I didn't respond immediately. Not because I didn't have something to say, but because I understood something in that moment that made any response unnecessary. They had already made their decision. Anything I said would only give them something to defend. So I put my phone down and went back to work. The contract in front of me wasn't small. It had taken months to build, weeks of negotiations, dozens of revisions, and more patience than I usually had to give. It was the kind of deal that didn't just change numbers, it changed direction. And that day, the final signatures were waiting. While my family was planning their perfect Thanksgiving dinner, arranging seating, choosing menus, deciding who would sit where, and how everything would look, I was finalizing something they would never understand. Not because it was complicated, but because it didn't fit into the version of me they had already decided was real. To them, I was unstable, freelance, unpredictable. The one who didn't follow a clear path, the one who didn't have a real job, the one who couldn't be explained easily in conversations with people they wanted to impress. It was easier to leave me out than to explain me. By the time the deal closed, it was already late afternoon. The kind of quiet satisfaction that comes after something long and difficult finally settles doesn't arrive loudly. It just sits there, steady, certain, undeniable. I leaned back in my chair, looked at the final confirmation, and, for a moment, allowed myself to acknowledge it. It wasn't just a win. It was proof. Proof that everything they didn't understand still worked. My phone buzzed again, but this time it wasn't them. It was one of my partners confirming the final transfer. Numbers I had spent years working toward had just moved into place. Opportunities that had once felt distant were now real, structured, and fully under my control. And in that moment, something shifted. Not emotionally, strategically. Because for the first time, I wasn't reacting to what they thought of me. I was deciding what came next. Later that evening, I checked the details for something I had almost forgotten about: the catering company my holding structure had acquired months earlier. It had been a quiet purchase, one of several, part of a larger plan that didn't need attention to work. The company specialized in high-end private events, exactly the kind of service people like my family would choose when they wanted everything to look perfect. I opened the schedule, and there it was. Their address, their event, their dinner, fully booked, fully paid, and completely dependent on something they had no idea I controlled. I stared at the screen for a moment, not surprised, just aware. Because the situation wasn't random. It wasn't coincidence. It was the kind of alignment that only happens when people assume they understand more than they actually do. They had built an entire evening around something they never thought to question. And I had built something they never thought to notice. The time on the booking showed arrival scheduled for just before guests were expected. Everything timed perfectly, every detail arranged, every expectation set. Perfect. I closed the file and leaned back slightly, thinking about that message again. Better for the family image if you stay home. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel hurt. I felt clear. Because respect isn't complicated. You either show it or you don't. And when you don't get to decide what happens next. The clock moved closer to evening, and I knew exactly when their dinner would start. I knew when the guests would arrive, when the first impression would matter most, when everything would need to be exactly as planned. And I also knew one more thing. At that exact moment, nothing would be there. By the time the sun had fully set, everything on their side would have been in motion. Guests arriving, coats being taken, polite conversations filling the rooms, the kind of carefully managed atmosphere my family always prioritized when appearances mattered more than anything else. I could picture it without being there, every detail predictable, every interaction rehearsed in that quiet way people do when they care more about how things look than how they feel. And at the center of all of it, an expectation. Dinner would arrive. Everything would be perfect. Because it always was. Until it wasn't. I checked the time again, not out of uncertainty, but precision. The catering team was scheduled to arrive just before the first wave of guests settled in, giving everything that seamless transition from conversation to presentation. That's how high-end service works. Invisible until the exact moment it needs to be seen. I opened my phone and pulled up the internal system. One file, one event. Their event. There's a moment right before a decision becomes real, where everything is still technically reversible. Where nothing has happened yet, but everything is already set in motion. That moment didn't feel heavy. It didn't feel dramatic. It felt simple. Because this wasn't about revenge. It was about balance. I selected the order, paused for half a second, and then canceled it. No announcement, no explanation, just a quiet change in a system they didn't even know existed. Within seconds, the confirmation updated. The delivery was gone. The staff was redirected. The event was empty. I locked my phone and set it down. At that exact moment, their door was probably opening for guests. At that exact moment, someone was probably asking when dinner would be served. At that exact moment, everything they planned was still intact, except for the one thing they assumed would never fail. Time passed slowly after that, not because I was waiting, but because I knew what was unfolding. Confusion first, then questions. Then the realization that something wasn't right. The call came sooner than I expected. My phone buzzed, and for a second, I just looked at it. My sister's name. Of course, I answered. Where is the catering? She asked immediately, her voice tight, controlled, but already cracking at the edges. I didn't rush to respond. I'm not sure, I said calmly. You're not sure, she repeated, louder this time. They're not here. The guests are already here. Do you understand what's happening right now? I did. Perfectly. But I let the silence sit for a second longer than necessary. Then I said, check who owns the company. There was a pause. A real one. Not confusion this time. Recognition. Because suddenly, pieces were starting to connect. She started, then stopped. I didn't interrupt. You did this, she asked, her voice dropping into something else now. Not anger. Not yet. Something closer to disbelief. I made a decision, I replied. You can't just cancel like that, she said quickly. We paid for it. This is a contract. Yes, I said. It is. Another pause. Because now she understood that this wasn't an accident. This wasn't a mistake that could be fixed with a quick call or a rushed apology. This was intentional. People are here, she said, quieter now. Do you have any idea how this looks? I almost smiled at that, because that had always been the point. I do, I said. Silence again. Longer this time. He needs to talk to you, she said finally, referring to my dad. I didn't say yes. I didn't say no. A few seconds later, his voice replaced hers. What is this? He asked, not loud, not aggressive, just controlled in the way people are when they're trying to keep everything from slipping. This, I said, is a canceled order. You're doing this over a misunderstanding, he asked. No, I replied calmly. There wasn't a misunderstanding. He didn't respond immediately, because he knew. They all knew. This wasn't about logistics. It was about something much simpler. You should have come tonight, he said. I wasn't invited, I answered. Another silence. Short, but enough. That's not what we meant, he added quickly. It is, I said. No emotion. No emphasis. Just truth. On the other side of the line, I could hear voices, movement, the quiet tension of a room that was no longer in control of itself. The kind of tension that spreads quickly when something important isn't where it's supposed to be. What do you want? He asked. There it was. The question that always comes when control shifts. I didn't rush the answer, because the answer wasn't complicated. Nothing, I said. This isn't about getting something. Then what is it about? He asked. I let a second pass. Respect, I said. The word settled heavier than anything else in that conversation. Because it wasn't something they could fix immediately. It wasn't something they could order, replace, or rearrange. It was something they either had or didn't. I can have the order reinstated, I added after a moment, not as an offer, but as a statement. But not tonight. He understood that, because timing matters. And that moment had already passed. The line stayed quiet for a few seconds longer before he spoke again, but this time his voice was different. Less controlled. More aware. We'll talk about this later, he said. Yes, I replied. We will. The call ended. I set my phone down again and leaned back, not thinking about what they were dealing with in that moment, not imagining the conversations, the explanations, the quiet embarrassment settling over everything they had planned so carefully. Because I didn't need to. I already knew. They wanted a perfect image. A flawless evening. A controlled story they could present to everyone around them. And they were willing to remove me from it to keep that image intact. But what they didn't understand was simple. You can't control the image if you don't control the reality behind it. They excluded me from their table. So I removed the one thing holding it together. Not out of anger, not out of impulse, but out of clarity. Because respect isn't optional. And neither are consequences.